They say history is written by the victors, but what happens when the truth is so disturbing that no one dares to record it? The story of King Edward II of England is one of the darkest and most controversial tales in royal history, marked by betrayal, humiliation, and a death so cruel that even medieval chroniclers hesitated to describe it. Today we'll dive into one of the most macabre royal scandals of all time, a tale of forbidden love, political revenge, and a punishment designed to erase not only a king's reign but also his dignity. Many believe Edward II died quietly in a cell, but others say his death was so violent, so symbolic, that it became legend, a murder not only of the body, but of pride. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and leave a like, not just to support this content, but because the YouTube algorithm depends on your interaction to decide whether stories like this will reach more people. Without your engagement, historical truths like this one fade into obscurity. And trust me, you'll want to watch until the end, because the final revelation will completely change the way you see medieval history. Tell me in the comments, what shocks you the most about this story? Edward's secret loves, his cruel enemies, or the fact that his own wife may have signed his death sentence? Let's find out together. Imagine being born surrounded by luxury, castles, and crowns, but never expecting the throne to be yours. That's how the story of Edward II began. The fourth son of the powerful King Edward I of England, born in 1284, at a time when being fourth in line to the throne meant living in the shadow of your older brothers, with no expectation of ever ruling an empire. He grew up believing his destiny was secondary, that he would never be at the center of power, and perhaps that's why he became a man unlike any king who came before him. While his father forged his name in battle and ruled through fear, young Edward preferred the simple pleasures of life: music, art, theatre, and long conversations that defied the cold protocol of royalty. From an early age, his sensitive nature was seen as weakness. The court whispered that he lacked the soul of a king. And in an age when a monarch was expected to embody strength and virility, that sounded like a death sentence. Edward grew up under the harsh gaze of his father, the legendary Edward I, known as Longshanks, a man of iron feared even by his allies. While the king took pride in his military victories and ruthless punishments, the young prince seemed to live in another world. He wasn't moved by swords, but by songs. He didn't crave power, but the company of those few who made him feel truly alive. And it was that search for affection, in a world so cold and political, that would become the most controversial aspect of his life. With the unexpected deaths of his older brothers, the destiny he never wanted began to draw near. England, torn by conflict and ambition, saw in that reluctant heir a threat to its stability. After all, how could a man so detached from the warrior traditions command a kingdom built on war and betrayal? But the inevitable happened. The throne, by a cruel twist of fate, fell into his hands. And with the crown came the silent disdain of the nobility, who watched him as one watches a man doomed to fail. Crowned in 1307, Edward II took the throne in a weary nation expecting a strong leader. But what they got was an emotional, introspective man, and, according to many, one easily swayed. From the very start, Edward's decisions seemed ruled more by heart than by reason, and in a court driven by political and family interests, that was a dangerous flaw. While his father had ruled with the sword, Edward ruled with affection, and that affection, as would soon be revealed, would become his downfall. Edward sought something he had never known: true loyalty. He found no comfort among ambitious nobles or councillors who hid their contempt behind bows. Then he met a man who would change his life and the fate of England forever. His name was Piers Gaveston. Young, charismatic, and daring, Gaveston possessed everything Edward admired: beauty, intelligence, and a rebellious spirit that defied the rigid world of the court. Their friendship blossomed quickly, but what seemed like a simple bond between companions soon became the greatest scandal the kingdom had ever seen. While nobles schemed in the shadows, Edward followed his heart, unaware that love and power can never coexist peacefully. He believed he could rule in his own way, without war, without intrigue, guided by kindness and loyalty. But the medieval world did not forgive gentle kings, and England would soon show him the price of defying its expectations. The first signs of discontent came early. The lords mocked his preferences, his lavish feasts, and the attention he lavished on certain companions. To them, Edward II was an insult to his father's legacy, a stain on a dynasty built on blood and conquest. But the king, oblivious to the poison of criticism, continued to live his way, convinced he could reshape kingship through love and devotion. What he didn't realize was that the same heart that made him human also made him vulnerable. And while he surrounded himself with those he thought he could trust, the court was already sharpening its political blades. Edward II was about to learn that in a world ruled by ambition and appearances, the greatest weakness of a king is being too human. And this is where his story begins to turn into tragedy, because the man who never wanted to be king would end up paying the highest price for it. In an age when kings were feared, not loved, and a man's strength was measured by his sword, not his heart, King Edward II dared to defy the greatest taboo of his time, to love whom society said he could not. The name that set the kingdom ablaze and shook the walls of the English court was Piers Gaveston, a young man of noble birth, but without the political power of the great families. Handsome, witty, and naturally charming, Gaveston was not just another courtier. He was the opposite of everything the aristocracy expected to see beside a king. While the nobles discussed war strategies and territorial alliances, Edward smiled at Gaveston's side, laughing, joking, and treating him with an intimacy no other man had ever dared to share with a monarch. The gesture was simple, human, but in a world of appearances and tradition, that gesture became the center of the greatest scandal in medieval England. From the first meeting, something changed in Edward. Contemporary accounts describe an intense, almost spiritual bond between them, a connection that seemed to transcend friendship and loyalty. Gaveston was not just a confidant, he was the light of the king's life, the only person who could make him forget the weight of the crown and the poison of politics. Edward called him my brother in soul, my inseparable companion, my other self. Words of affection that, to the society of the time, sounded like a challenge to morality and divine order. What began as curiosity and rumor soon turned into public outrage. The court saw their relationship as dangerous, and not merely for moral reasons. Power was at stake. Gaveston, with his bold nature and sharp mind, began gaining influence within the palace. Edward showered him with privileges, lands, titles, jewels, and high offices. The king made him Earl of Cornwall, one of the highest honours in England, unthinkable for a man without royal blood. To the nobles, it was a direct insult. They saw Gaveston as an insolent intruder, someone who used the king's love as a shield to manipulate decisions and enrich himself. And perhaps worse than that, they saw a blind king, ruled by emotion, unable to see the political consequences of his actions. But Edward was undeterred. He protected Gaveston, praised him publicly, and even described him in official documents as the most loyal of all men. For a medieval monarch, that was a declaration of love in every sense, a provocation the nobility would never forgive. The English elite felt humiliated. Their sons, alliances, and privileges were being ignored in favor of a young man who, in their eyes, was nothing more than an arrogant adventurer. And at the center of this storm stood Isabella of France, the Queen, sent as part of a powerful political alliance between two crowns. Daughter of the most feared king in Europe, she expected to find a strong husband, worthy of the English throne. But upon arrival, she realized her husband's heart already belonged to someone else. Isabella was young, beautiful, and intelligent, but not blind. She watched in silence as the king devoted to his favorite the gestures and affections that should have been hers. Over time, her quiet suffering turned into resentment, and resentment into strategy. In 1308, under pressure from Parliament, the Church, and even his own allies, Edward was forced to banish Gaveston from England. The king, devastated, resisted until the last moment, but eventually gave in. It was both a personal and political blow. Chronicles describe a broken Edward, locked in his chambers, refusing to govern, speaking of Gaveston's exile as if he had lost a part of himself. But the king's heart spoke louder. Only a year later, he found a political loophole and brought his beloved back. Gaveston's return was triumphant. The king welcomed him with celebrations, honours, and public affection that bordered on provocation. But this defiance had a price. The nobles, humiliated and furious, united in action. What had begun as a political feud turned into a personal hunt. In 1312, after a series of confrontations, Gaveston was captured, given a mock trial, and executed. His decapitation was carried out in secret, away from the king's presence, to avoid immediate retaliation. When Edward learned of his death, the palace fell silent. He wept before the court, refused to eat, and dressed in mourning. They say his fury was so great that he vowed to avenge every drop of spilled blood. But in that moment, the king who had seemed weak revealed the most human and most dangerous side of his reign. That of a man willing to defy the entire world for love. England was never the same again. Gaveston's death divided the country, weakened the crown, and turned Edward II's image into that of a tragic figure. To some, he was a foolish, lovesick ruler. To others, a man who dared to live a true feeling, even if it cost him his crown. Chroniclers tried to erase this story, rewriting it through the lens of prejudice. They portrayed Gaveston as a manipulator and Edward as a naive fool. Yet beneath the distorted pages of history, one can still glimpse the humanity of this king, a man who loved in a time when love was a crime, who sought affection on a frozen throne and paid the price for it. After Piers's death, Edward was never the same. He became suspicious, darker, obsessed with loyalty. He surrounded himself with new favourites, like Hugh Despencer, trying to fill the void that haunted him. But the emotional wound Gaveston left never healed. The king who had defied an empire for love now ruled surrounded by enemies, carrying within him the weight of a loss that would change the fate of an entire nation. And while the ghost of Piers Gaveston still hovered over the throne, England was slowly descending into chaos. The romance that began with passion was about to turn into tragedy, a story of revenge, betrayal, and downfall. Edward II's love for Piers Gaveston had left deep scars on England, open wounds on the nobility's honour, and a collective sense of humiliation that time would not erase. When Gaveston was executed in 1312, the barons believed they had restored order and freed the kingdom from a corrupting influence. But instead of peace came a quiet fury. Edward did not forget, and when a king bears a grudge, the price is always paid in blood. Edward's grief turned to rage, a rage that grew with every look of contempt, every whispered word in the halls of power. He swore that his enemies would kneel, even if it meant plunging his own country into chaos. It was in this atmosphere of tension that a new figure emerged at the heart of the king's life, Hugh Despencer, an ambitious, cold and calculating man. Unlike Gaveston, whose presence brought light to the king, Despencer was pure darkness, and he knew exactly how to use it to his advantage. Where Gaveston was charisma, Despencer was control. He sought not only the king's affection, but the power that came with it. Gradually, he began to manipulate Edward, removing councillors, exiling rivals, and amassing lands and wealth that belonged to entire noble families. The barons who had once tolerated Gaveston as a passing fancy now faced something far more dangerous, a true tyrant behind the throne. Despencer used the king's name to seize property, punish opponents, and enrich his family. He and his father, Hugh Despencer the Elder, built an empire of fear within the court, acting as though England were their private estate. And the most frightening part was that Edward, blinded by loyalty and need, allowed it all. The king who had once been humiliated now became complicit in the humiliation of others. The kingdom began to crumble. Famine spread, taxes rose, and the barons' lands were seized under false charges. Discontent grew not only among the nobility but also among the people. And when the people and the lords unite against the king, the crown begins to shake. Parliament demanded that Despencer be exiled, but Edward refused. He no longer ruled with reason, but with resentment. Every decree, every order was a response to the scorn he had carried since Gaveston's death. Queen Isabella, once silent and submissive, began to see the collapse of both the kingdom and her own dignity. The husband she had once tried to understand was now a bitter man, dominated by a cruel advisor and consumed by an almost pathological thirst for vengeance. When Isabella tried to intervene, Edward pushed her aside, humiliated her publicly, and stripped her of resources. The royal marriage, which had long been a political facade, finally fell apart. By 1321, the barons' patience had run out. Led by Thomas of Lancaster, the king's cousin and one of the most powerful men in England, a coalition formed to confront Edward and the Despensers. The conflict that followed was brutal. For months, castles were seized, villages burned, and the country descended into civil war. At first, the rebels had the upper hand. They forced the exile of the Despensers and partially restored the old order. But Edward, once again, refused to accept defeat. He reorganized his forces, called on Welsh allies, and marched against the barons. Revenge came with cruelty. In 1322, at the Battle of Boroughbridge, the king's troops crushed the rebels. Thomas of Lancaster was captured and executed, and Edward, consumed by grim satisfaction, had his head displayed publicly. The message was clear: no one would defy Edward II and live. But the victory came at a cost. England was devastated, famine spread, and fear ruled the land. With the Despensers back in power, tyranny reached its peak. They ruled in the king's name, but only for themselves. They stole, tortured, confiscated, and destroyed anyone who opposed them. Edward seemed to have lost all control. He was no longer the gentle, naive king of the past, but neither was he a strong monarch. He was a broken man, sustained only by blind loyalty to those who manipulated him most. The image of kingship had been irreparably tarnished. The nobility, now silent, waited for the right moment to strike again. And the one who would deliver the final blow was the person Edward least expected: his wife, Queen Isabella. The woman who had once wept in silence had now become a strategist. She knew that power was not taken by swords alone, but through alliances. And in the shadows, Isabella began weaving a web of conspiracies that would unite nobles, enemies, and even the French crown. The king, blinded by resentment and misplaced trust in the Despensers, never saw that the vengeance he so carefully nurtured was about to turn against him. Because sometimes in history, revenge doesn't come from your enemies. It comes from within your own palace. For years, Isabella of France, the Queen of England, lived in the shadow of humiliation. Married to Edward II while still a teenager, she was sent from Paris as a symbol of an alliance between two of the greatest powers in Europe. Daughter of the feared King Philip the Fair, she grew up amid intrigue, diplomacy, and power. She was intelligent, cultured, and politically astute. But in London, she discovered that intelligence and beauty were not enough when the king's heart belonged to another. From the start, Isabella realized there was no place for her at Edward's side. He ignored her in public, deprived her of political influence, and worse, openly displayed his favourites, first Piers Gaveston, then Hugh Despenser, as if they were true consorts. While the king flaunted his affection for ambitious, arrogant men, Isabella was forced to watch in silence, swallowing every insult and every look of disdain. But deceiving a wounded woman is dangerous, and underestimating a queen is fatal. Little by little, Isabella ceased to be merely a neglected wife and began to transform into something far more dangerous. A strategist thirsty for justice. She watched, waited, and learned. When she realized that Despenser held complete sway over the king and that the country was sinking into tyranny, she understood that survival, and the future of her son, Prince Edward, depended on a bold stroke, and that is exactly what she delivered. In 1325, Edward II sent Isabella to France on a diplomatic mission to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, the new French king. He thought distance would weaken the queen, but the opposite happened. Far from the English court, Isabella breathed freedom for the first time. In Paris, surrounded by allies and nobles discontented with the English government, she began to plan something audacious. There, she met again a man who would change everything: Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was an exiled noble who had escaped prison for opposing the Despensers. Intelligent, charismatic, and as determined as she was, he quickly became her ally, and according to contemporary rumor, her lover. The relationship between Isabella and Mortimer was the turning point of the story. United by love and vengeance, they began gathering political and military support for a triumphant return to England, not as queen and rebel, but as conquerors. In 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed on English soil with a small army and the backing of nobles who saw in that invasion a chance to rid themselves of Edward's corrupt rule and the Despensers. The people, weary of hunger and oppression, welcomed the Queen as a liberator. Cities surrendered without resistance. One by one, the king's allies abandoned him. Even soldiers began to desert. Edward, desperate, fled with Hugh Despencer in a futile attempt to escape the tightening net. But fate was already sealed. The Queen's forces pursued them into Wales, where both were captured. The king's fall was as swift as it was humiliating. Isabella made a point of showing the world that the woman he had scorned now surpassed him in power and strategy. Despencer was summarily tried and brutally executed, hanged, disemboweled, quartered, and displayed to the public as the symbol of the end of an era of tyranny. Edward, on the other hand, was not granted the same mercy nor the same death. The deposed king was taken under heavy guard to Kenilworth Castle and soon after transferred to Berkeley. There, he was forced to abdicate the throne in favour of his own son, the young Edward III, who was only 14. The ceremony was cold and silent. The man who had once been king of all England now knelt before his own child, declaring himself unworthy to rule. The boy, embarrassed and manipulated by Isabella and Mortimer, could barely look his father in the eye. It was a moment that marked not only the end of a reign, but the emotional collapse of an entire family. Isabella, now the most powerful woman in England, ruled in her son's name, alongside Mortimer. Together, they formed a transitional government, but absolute power soon corrupted them. The she-wolf of France, as her enemies called her, had achieved what she wanted: revenge, control, and freedom. But slowly, her heroine's image began to unravel. The same nobles who had supported her started to distrust her ambitions. They said she and Mortimer were spending the royal treasury on banquets, parties, and luxuries, living like monarchs while the true king, the young Edward III, was merely a puppet. The Queen, who had destroyed a tyrant, was becoming one herself. And England, which had welcomed Isabella as a saviour, now murmured her name in fear. The woman who had been betrayed was now seen as a traitor. And while the former king rotted in captivity, rumours began to circulate that the she-wolf of France was not satisfied with merely deposing her husband. She wanted to get rid of him for good. What happened next, the cruel fate of King Edward VI, would become one of the most horrendous and controversial episodes in the entire history of the English monarchy. Officially, King Edward II of England died peacefully in his cell at Berkeley Castle on a cold night in September 1327. At least, that is what the royal records claimed. A quiet end for a monarch who had lived surrounded by scandals, rebellions, and betrayals. But as with almost everything in Edward's life, the truth seemed very different. Witnesses of the time, and chroniclers who dared to write what they heard, told another story. A story of horror, torture, and revenge. They say the king did not die in his sleep. They say he was made to pay, with pain and humiliation, for all the sins the country believed he had committed. The rumours began shortly after the official news of his death. No body had been publicly shown, and the burial took place in haste. All England whispered what really happened at Berkeley Castle. Some spoke of poisoning, others of suffocation. But the version that spread the most and survived the longest is also the most terrible. According to it, the guards received secret orders to eliminate the king without leaving visible marks. Thus he would be tortured and killed with a red-hot poker introduced into his body, burning him from the inside without leaving external wounds. It would be a symbolic execution, a punishment for his unnatural sins, a cruel death for a king whose life had been marked by forbidden loves. This narrative, so graphic and shocking, became legend. But the question is, was it true or merely propaganda? Many historians believe that version was invented by Edward's enemies, a way to turn his death into a moral spectacle. At the time, the church and the nobility wanted not only to erase the king from history, but also to stain his memory. Such a grotesque death would serve as a warning. A king who defies the divine order pays the price. But there are also those who say that, in that damp, silent castle, reality was even darker than any rumour. Accounts describe Edward's imprisonment as a nightmare. The dungeons of Berkeley Castle were cold and rat-infested. They say the ex-king's cries of pain echoed through the stone corridors at night, to the point that the guards tried to drown out the sound with drums. He, who had once been the most powerful man in England, was now reduced to a forgotten prisoner, fed scraps and kept in complete darkness. Some letters even claim he was forced to watch the execution of his few allies before he was killed. But Edward II's death bears an even deeper aura of mystery, because despite the official versions and the torture rumours, there are documents and testimonies indicating another possibility, that the king never died at Berkeley. Decades later, reports emerged of a mysterious man living in Italy, known as William the Welshman, who claimed to be the former King of England. Letters attributed to Edward III himself, the son who supposedly inherited the throne after his father's death, suggest the young monarch knew the truth. In those messages he mentions the return of a prisoner of noble blood who lives in secret. Did Isabella of France and Roger Mortimer fake Edward's death to rid themselves of him without causing an uproar? Or did the Queen, remorseful, allow him to be spared and quietly exiled, living out the rest of his life far from the world's gaze? To this day, no one is sure. Edward II's tomb in Gloucester Cathedral was opened centuries later, and the remains found bore no clear signs of violence, but neither did they prove anything. The mystery endures. The truth is that, whether dead or hidden, Edward II's end symbolised something far greater than the fate of one man. It represented the hatred, fear and hypocrisy of a society that could not accept a king who was too human, too fragile, and above all, too different. His death became a message etched into the English imagination. Power does not forgive vulnerability. A king could be cruel, ruthless, or tyrannical, but never sensitive. The people who had once despised him slowly began to see him with pity. The man who had been ridiculed for loving was transformed into a silent martyr, a symbol of how power destroys even those who try to rule with the heart. And the greatest irony of all is that his death, real or not, gave rise to the downfall of the very traitors. Soon after, Edward's son came of age, seized power, and executed Mortimer, his mother's lover, restoring the throne with blood and vengeance. Isabella, the she-wolf of France, ended her days isolated and forgotten, living under the watch of her own son. Edward VI, the king who dared to love when love was a crime, left the world shrouded in shadow and mystery. But the legend never died. To this day, his name is whispered as a warning that power and love rarely coexist, and that the most painful truths of history are always those no one wants to believe. The end of Edward II seemed certain. The deposed king, hated by some and forgotten by others, was said to have died in 1327 under terrible circumstances in the dungeons of Berkeley Castle. At least, that's what the official history wanted the world to believe. But time, as always, keeps its secrets, and as the decades passed, clues began to surface suggesting that the king's death might have been one of the greatest political deceptions of the Middle Ages. Letters, testimonies, and travellers' accounts pointed to a truth that defied centuries of silence. Edward II may have survived. The first doubts came from mysterious documents discovered years after his supposed death. A letter sent to young Edward III, the new king, mentioned a noble prisoner who had escaped and was living in hiding under another name. The author, an Italian monk named Manuel de Fieschi, claimed that Edward II had not been murdered, but secretly freed and taken to the continent. The letter contained details only someone very close to the king could have known: the locations of his imprisonment, the names of his guards, and even the route of his escape. It stated that Edward had crossed France, lived disguised as a monk, and spent his final days in Italy in a remote monastery. Historians have debated this possibility for centuries. Some believe the letter was fabricated, an attempt to undermine the legitimacy of Edward III's reign. Others, however, argue that there is real evidence the king survived. Later accounts describe a mysterious man living in the mountains near Milan, known as William the Welshman, who received discreet visits from messengers arriving from England. His physical resemblance to the former king was striking, and records show that even local monks believed they were sheltering a man of royal blood. But the truth is that amid so many versions, one thing remains undeniable. The death of Edward II, or his supposed escape, became one of the greatest enigmas in European history. Some say that Isabella, the she-wolf of France, did not have the heart to kill her husband and staged his death instead. Others believe she truly delivered him to torture, and that the rumours of survival were merely a way to ease her son's guilt. Either way, the mystery helped fuel one of the most haunting legends of the English monarchy, that of the king the world tried to erase, but who may have lived on, watching from afar as his enemies fell. Edward II's legacy does not lie on battlefields or in political reforms, but in something far more human and far more painful. He was a man destroyed by love, by naivety, and by betrayal. A king who loved in a time when love could cost a life. His story is above all a reflection of the price of defying the world and the consequences of being different in an age that did not forgive weakness, emotion, or vulnerability. His death or disappearance became a symbol of the hypocrisy and cruelty of a society that preferred killing to understanding. And that's why, centuries later, we still talk about him. Because Edward II, the king who dared to feel, left a mark that not even fire and iron could erase. History judged him, but time turned him into a myth, and myths, as we know, never truly die. If you've made it this far, you already understand that the story of Edward II is not just about politics, crowns, and betrayals. It's about the price of being human in a world that rejects fragility. It's about a man who, amid wars and conspiracies, dared to follow his heart and paid the ultimate price for it. And it's also about how love, even wrapped in tragedy, can transcend centuries and survive oblivion. Now I want to know your opinion. Do you believe Edward II was brutally murdered, as the legends say, or that he survived and lived the rest of his life in silence, far from everything? Leave your comment below. I read them all, and I love hearing your thoughts on these mysteries that defy history. If you liked the video, don't forget to leave a like. It helps the channel grow and tells YouTube that this content deserves to reach more people. And of course, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell. It may seem like a small gesture, but it's thanks to your subscription that this project stays alive, bringing you stories time tried to hide. When you subscribe, you're helping keep alive the memory of figures like Edward II, ensuring that the past is never forgotten. And before you go, here's an invitation. Watch the video that's appearing on your screen right now. It's even more fascinating and emotional than this one. A story full of twists, secrets, and feelings that, like this one, will keep you hooked until the very last second. See you there, and remember, history may try to bury the truth, but some voices never go silent.